The needle on the analog voltmeter didn't just spike. It began to vibrate with such violent frequency that the glass casing shattered, spraying Cassidy's desk with crystalline shards. Outside, the absolute silence of the Cherokee forest was suddenly replaced by a heavy, subterranean thrum that she didn't hear with her ears, but felt in the marrow of her teeth. When she looked through her binoculars toward the tree line, she didn't see predators hunting. She saw a grizzly, a cougar, and a wolf standing side by side in a perfect, motionless circle, their eyes clouded over with a milky white film as they stared directly at her station. A sharp, metallic tang of ozone filled the room, and the radio on the wall began to leak a fine, black dust from its speakers. Instead of static, a rhythmic grinding of wet stones poured from the device, a sound that mimicked the cadence of human speech but lacked any recognizable vowels. Cassidy reached for her journal to record the anomaly, only to find the pages already filled. In her own handwriting, hundreds of lines of fresh indigo ink crawled across the paper, repeating a single phrase over and over again until the paper was sodden and tearing, though she hadn't picked up a pen all night. The old Nava groaned, its suspension protesting as Cassidy McGraw forced the vehicle over a deep fissure in the asphalt. She didn't slow down. Her knuckles, white against the cracked leather of the steering wheel, pulsed with the rhythm of her heart. To her left, a rusted sign leaned at a precarious angle. The words "strictly prohibited," "quarantine zone," faded by decades of sun and neglect. She ignored it, driving over a heavy chain that had long ago surrendered to the mud and gravel. The Cherokee forests didn't welcome her so much as they swallowed her, the dense canopy of interweaving pines closing overhead like a vaulted ceiling. Branches, thin and skeletal, scraped against the windshield with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. When the ranger station finally appeared through the gloom, it looked less like a sanctuary and more like a corpse. The paint was a memory of gray, peeling away in long, sickly strips to reveal rotting wood that smelled of damp earth and slow decay. Cassidy killed the engine. The silence that followed was immediate and suffocating, a heavy, dusty blanket that pressed against her eardrums. She sat for a moment, pushing her thin metal frames back up the bridge of her nose, a nervous tick she barely acknowledged. Outside, the world felt expectant. She stepped onto the porch, the floorboards shrieking under her boots. And though she saw no one, the sensation of 1,000 eyes peering from the dark spaces between the trunks made the hair on her neck stand on end. Inside, the air was a stagnant soup of mildew and antiseptic. She dropped her heavy equipment cases onto a scarred oak table, sending a cloud of gray dust swirling into the shafts of dying light that pierced the shuttered windows. These were the moments she lived for. The moments where the scorn of the academic world, the whispers of madness and unprofessionalism, faded into the background. She reached into her bag, pulling out yellowed dossiers marked with the stamp of old secrets. Her fingers traced the margins where she had scribbled notes about the devouring sound and the disappearances that the government preferred to call hiker error. Her hands shook, just a fraction, as she began the ritual of setup. Cables snaked across the warped floor like black vines, connecting sensors to the glowing green eye of an oscilloscope. She placed directional microphones in the corners of the room, their metallic heads glinting in the flicker of the overhead fluorescent lights. The hum of the station's old generator kicked in, a low-frequency thrum that vibrated in her teeth. As she adjusted the filters, trying to tune into the frequencies that existed just beyond the reach of human biology, the air took on a sharp, metallic tang, the scent of ozone and ancient static. By the time she stepped back out into the woods, the sun was a bruised purple smear behind the trees. Cassidy followed a phantom pressure in her temples, a dull ache that grew sharper as she moved deeper into the thicket. She found the first anomaly in a clearing where the trees had simply stopped growing, as if an invisible wall prevented their encroachment. In the center lay a sight that defied every law of predation. A dozen deer and foxes were arranged in a perfect geometric circle, nose to tail. Their fur was a pristine, ghostly white, stripped of all color. She knelt beside a fallen wolf, her fingers hovering over its flank. When she finally touched it, the skin gave way like hollow parchment. There was no blood, no scent of rot. Even the flies, usually the first heralds of death, were absent. The silence here wasn't just the absence of noise. It was a physical weight, a vacuum that seemed to suck the very breath from her lungs. She pulled a Geiger counter from her belt, expecting the frantic chatter of radiation. But the needle remained sluggish, ticking with a lazy, mocking indifference. The soil she sampled was black and rich, yet it felt like fine, dry sand between her calloused fingers. Back at her makeshift lab, the chemical tests returned results that were maddeningly perfect. The nitrogen levels, the mineral balance, everything was in an ideal state of equilibrium. It was a paradise on paper. But beneath her boots, the gray, brittle grass told a different story. Her logic, the very foundation of her identity, began to skid and stall against this impossible normalcy. Returning to the station felt like retreating into a cage. She donned her heavy headphones, turning the gain on the external microphones to their absolute limit. The monitor showed a flat line of infrasound. But as she watched, the needles on the analog voltmeters began to shiver. They weren't reacting to wind or movement. They were vibrating in perfect synchronization with her own pulse. She held her breath, the silence in the headphones becoming a roar of static pressure. Outside, the natural world had simply opted out. No cicadas, no evening birds, no rustle of nocturnal scavengers. The air felt thick, like she was submerged in a vat of cooling wax. She clapped her hands sharply, but the sound didn't echo. It was swallowed instantly by the shadows, falling flat as if the atmosphere itself had lost its elasticity. Then came the strike. It wasn't a sound so much as a geological event. A dull, heavy thud erupted from beneath the floorboards, a subterranean pulse that launched Cassidy from her chair. The windows didn't just break. They imploded, showering the room in a glittering rain of glass. She hit the floor, her hands over her head, as the walls began to scream in resonance. The power died instantly, plunging her into a darkness so absolute it felt liquid. Her teeth ached, a deep, marrow-level vibration that made her want to claw the bones out of her jaw. When she finally managed to click on a flashlight, the beam cut through the dust to find the recorder's screen. It hadn't died. The display didn't show the chaotic spikes of an explosion. Instead, it showed a series of perfect, fractal patterns, geometric symmetries that looked like the scales of a serpent or the petals of a mathematical flower. It was a language written in vibration, a code that no natural force should be able to produce. As the first gray light of dawn bled through the shattered window frames, Cassidy peered through her binoculars at the tree line. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Standing at the edge of the clearing were the predators, grizzlies, cougars, wolves, all spaced at equal intervals. They weren't hunting. They weren't fighting. They were standing perfectly still, their gaze fixed on the station. Through the lenses, she saw a milky white film over the eyes of a massive bear. They were a living barricade, a ritual guard. A strange warmth began to replace her terror. It started in her chest and radiated outward, a tingling euphoria that made her laugh, a sound that felt like the first real thing she'd ever heard. The fear of death, the memory of Liam's ruptured eardrums, the shame of her exile. it all evaporated. She began to move through the shards of glass, her steps light, almost dancing. This wasn't a threat anymore. It was a coronation. She was the one who had stayed. She was the one who had listened. She reached for her headphones again, desperate to submerge herself in the rising symphony of the forest. But as she reached for the dial, she realized the station was no longer empty. The scent of fried bacon and coffee hit her first, a domestic, jarring smell that didn't belong in this temple of static. She walked into the kitchen area. A plate of eggs sat on the table, steam still rising in lazy curls. A fork lay overturned. Silas, the ranger who had been her only tether to the world of men, was gone. His chair still held the indentation of his body. On the floor, his heavy boot lay near the door, and his cap was crushed as if by an invisible weight. Cassidy grabbed the radio, her thumb frantic on the talk button. "Silas, come in, Silas." The response wasn't a voice. It was a sound like wet stones grinding together in the throat of a giant. Hundreds of overlapping whispers, devoid of vowels, poured from the speaker. The plastic casing of the radio began to heat up in her hand, and a fine, black dust started to leak from the speaker mesh. The language, if it was a language, vibrated in her palm, a rhythmic, guttural chant that seemed to be counting down the seconds of her life. She backed away, the radio clattering to the floor. She needed to see the exterior. Pressing her back against the rough-hewn timber of the outer wall, she circled the building. Her flashlight revealed deep, vertical furrows in the wood. Huge sections of pine had been gouged out, the white sap weeping like blood. The steel brackets at the corners of the house were twisted into spirals. Whatever had done this had the strength of a tectonic shift and the precision of a surgeon. She retreated to her desk and opened her leather-bound journal, looking for her notes on the 40 hertz threshold. Her breath hitched. The pages were no longer hers. In her own handwriting, the words "listen to the silence" were written over and over. Thousands of times, the ink bleeding through the paper until the pages were a sodden indigo mess. Her own fingertips were stained blue. She had no memory of picking up the pen. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced her euphoria. She ran to Silas's room, her boots echoing on the boards. She felt a loose plank near his bed, something he'd mentioned once in a drunken moment of lucidity. She pried it up with a knife. Beneath it lay a canvas roll. Inside were Polaroid photos of men and women in lab coats, their faces familiar from the university archives. But in every photo, the eyes had been burned out. Neat, surgical holes occupied the sockets. On the back of the last photo, in Silas's neat ranger's script, was her own name. Movement caught her eye. She looked out the window and saw him. Silas was walking out of the fog. He wore his plaid shirt, but his movement was wrong. His limbs snapped forward in jerky mechanical arcs, like a marionette being piloted by someone who didn't understand how joints worked. As he reached the porch, he tilted his head back. His eyes were gone, replaced by the same black, bottomless voids she had seen in the photos. He began to hit his head against the door. Thud, thud, thud. There was no cry of pain, no grunt of effort, just the wet, rhythmic sound of bone meeting wood. Cassidy threw her weight against a heavy dresser, sliding it in front of the door. Dark blood began to seep under the threshold, soaking into the floorboards at her feet. She covered her ears, but the sound of his skull collapsing in the silence of the woods was louder than any scream. She scrambled to the archives, tearing through maps until she found a hand-drawn parchment. The station wasn't a research post. On the map, it was marked with a single, ancient term: the altar of offerings. The migration paths, the ley lines, the very architecture of the forest was a funnel designed to pour everything into this one square of earth. She looked at her equipment again, really looking this time. She saw the copper jumpers, the modifications to the oscillators. They weren't measuring the sound, they were generating it. They were broadcast towers for a frequency that turned the human brain into a receiver for the forest's hunger. She tried to pull the plugs, but her muscles felt like wet clay. Her will was a flickering candle in a hurricane. Driven by a sudden, desperate impulse, she descended into the cellar. The air was colder here, smelling of old bricks and something sweet. She found the wall, a section of fresh concrete that shouldn't have been there. In the beam of her light, she saw human hair protruding from the mortar. Metal electrodes were hammered into the concrete, vibrating with a low, subharmonic hum. She realized the previous researcher wasn't dead. He was the hardware. His body, encased in the stone, was being used as a biological resonator to amplify the forest's call. Her legs began to move on their own. She didn't command them. They simply began to walk her back up the stairs, out the back door, and into the waiting arms of the trees. The predators didn't move as she passed. They remained in their frozen, ritualistic boo. Cassidy walked through a haze of white ash that rose from the ground, a fine powder that tasted of bone. As she moved deeper, the silence became an absolute acoustic vacuum. She felt the pressure in her head reach a breaking point. Blood began to leak from her nose, then her ears, hot and thick. She reached the center. The earth opened up into a vast, pulsing crater lined with what looked like muscle and root. At the center was the entity, a gargantuan mass of wood, bone, and translucent membranes that glowed with a sickly, phosphorescent green. In the walls of the pit, she saw the others. They were woven into the structure, their limbs elongated, their mouths fixed in the same 40 hertz scream she had seen on her monitors. The entity didn't speak, it broadcast. Cassidy was hit by a tidal wave of memory. Not hers, but the collective agony of everyone the forest had ever eaten. She felt the roots growing through her own eyes, felt her ribs being reshaped into tuning forks. The entity showed her its greatness, its ancient hunger, and it demanded her surrender. It wanted her mind to be the new processor for its hunting patterns. She sank to her knees, her fingers digging into the ash. White thread-like mycelium began to erupt from the soil, stitching themselves into her skin. She felt the roots entering her veins, replacing her blood with the cold, bitter sap of the woods. A sense of horrific peace began to wash over her. Why fight? Why be a lonely, disgraced woman when you could be part of a god? But then she saw Liam, not the Liam of her dreams, but a flicker of his actual face in the wall of the pit. He wasn't at peace. He was a component, a piece of used-up meat in a machine that didn't care about science or truth or beauty. It only cared about expansion. The hatred that flared in her was hotter than the euphoria. Her pride, the very thing that had brought her here, became her weapon. She wasn't an offering. She was Cassidy McGraw, and she was a scientist. She reached into her pocket. Her fingers, already turning gray and stiff, found the small, rugged digital recorder she always kept on her person. She had been recording the entire time. The devouring sound, the 40 hertz pulse, the scream of the forest. It was all on the tiny SD card. She didn't try to run. She couldn't. Instead, she turned the volume to maximum and held the device against her own throat, using her body as a conductor. She hit play. The feedback was instantaneous and cataclysmic. The sound of the forest, played back into itself, created an acoustic loop that tore through the clearing. Cassidy felt her eardrums finally give way. A sharp, wet pop that plunged her into a world of eternal, muffled gray. But she didn't stop. She dragged herself back toward the station, her wrists tearing out of the fungal threads, leaving strips of her skin behind. She reached the lab. Her vision was swimming in red, her balance destroyed by the loss of her inner ear. She grabbed a handful of patch cables, her hands slick with blood. She bypassed the limiters on the big Marshall amplifiers she'd brought for the long-range tests. She created a closed loop between the microphones and the speakers, a screaming circle of sound that began to shake the very foundations of the station. The devouring sound met its own echo, and the resulting resonance was a physical force. Glass turned to dust. The vacuum tubes in her equipment exploded in a spray of white-hot light. Outside, the entity began to thrash. The giant roots tore themselves out of the earth, tossing trees and ash into the air as the forest's own nervous system was overloaded by the feedback loop. Cassidy found the gas can in the corner. She didn't hesitate. She doused her notes, her equipment, and the floorboards. She looked at the indigo-stained pages of her journal, the evidence of her madness and her brilliance, and she struck a match. The station went up in a roar of orange flame. She fell out the window into the dirt, her clothes smoking. She didn't look back. She couldn't hear the fire, couldn't hear the dying screams of the organisms in the woods. She simply crawled, then stumbled, toward the gray line of the highway. When the truck driver found her, she was a ghost of a woman, covered in soot and dried blood, standing in the middle of the road. He was screaming at her, his face contorted in terror, but to Cassidy, he was a silent film. She looked at his moving lips and felt nothing but a profound, hollow relief. Weeks later, in the sterile white silence of a hospital in Little Rock, Cassidy sat by the window. The doctors spoke to her with pens and paper, their faces full of pity. Total bilateral cochlear destruction, the note said. Irreparable. They thought she was a victim. They thought she had lost everything, her hearing, her career, her mind. Cassidy looked out at the trees on the hospital grounds. She saw the wind bending the branches, saw the birds opening their beaks to sing. She felt the vibration of the world through the soles of her feet. But the voices were gone. The shepherd, the 40 hertz hunger, the demands of the woods. They could no longer reach her. She ran a thumb over the jagged scars on her palms. She didn't need to prove she was right anymore. She didn't need the university's respect or the world's validation. In the perfect, shimmering silence of her new life, she had found the only truth that mattered. The forest was still there, and it was still hungry. But for the first time in her life, Cassidy McGraw was finally, truly alone. And in that solitude, she was free.